Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another lecture video for CSi3150. So last time where we left off was basically designing our navbar, right? So essentially what we did was we took the what is this? Okay, so we took the portfolio website that we were working on, and we applied some styling rules to the navbar essentially. Okay, and towards the end of the class last time, we were stuck with a bug, right, where I had made a mistake. So I think I'd shared the video already with respect to what the error was. So essentially, just to give you a background for those who haven't seen that video yet, essentially, when you're trying to do the drop-down navbar, right? So a behavior that is similar to when you kind of hover over the primary tab, whatever the subheaders are or the sub menu options that you have, it kind of pops open below it, right? So what the mistake there was is, in order to implement something like this, you have to set up a scenario wherein you are setting the positioning or the layout of the child element with respect to the parent element. Okay, so in this case that we were coding, the parent element was essentially the primary menu option, which was our projects menu, right? So when you set this up, you have to essentially take this, which is acting as the parent, and set its positioning as relative. Okay, this is the value of the CSS property. And then the property itself is known as positioning. So if you pay attention to what we had here, somewhere in the project. So here the positioning was set as relative, and this is the class name, which is essentially selecting the project's option itself, right, which is the parent element. And whenever you want to set something up with respect to the parent, that is, if you have, let's say, a child node, and this child node could be a div container, and that div container maybe has all of your menu options or sub options that you want to display. In this particular case, it's a menu option. It could be anything else in your case that you're trying to do. So what you do is you take the child and you set its position as absolute, right? So this essentially connects the style of specifying the styling rules for your layout, essentially connects the child, or basically routes the child to your parent, right? So the mistake, and as a result of that, if you do something like that and then put the things together, when you hover over this, you get the drop-down menu. And that anchoring factor that is here, which is the drop-down menu option, is kind of anchored to the parent node. That is achieved by making sure that we set the parent as position relative and then set the child as position absolute, right? And it then connects together. The error that I made was essentially a typo. So what happened is, this was our parent element in the HTML, right? So if you have seen the video, you already know this, but what happened was this li element, which is supposed to be the parent element, I had essentially closed it off before including this whole container was the child element, right? So before including this inside the parent element, I had actually closed this li off. So this li that you see in line 56 on my screen right now, this was essentially there somewhere around line 48. So what happened was, because of this li element, which is supposed to have this UL class drop-down element as its child, was not done in the right way. So when we wrote that CSS property trying to connect the parent to the child, there was no child. And as a result of that, no matter what we did after that in our CSS file, nothing was actually being applied because there was no child of the parent that we were working with. Does everybody follow the bug that, well, it's not a bug, it's a typo essentially, but you have to keep that in mind, right? If you ever fall into a situation like this where you have an error with CSS, step by step, of course, there is no proper debugging options for us, right? So what we have to do is kind of take a step back from the styling rules that we're working with, and then move back one by one to see where you made the mistake, right? It's cascading in nature. So if the last styling rule doesn't work, that's where the problem essentially is. So essentially what I did is, first of all, I didn't know that I made this mistake at this point of time. To give you like my approach of what I did to identify where the problem was, I started off with this, right? So this, if you remember, is CSS pseudo classes. So what that means is that whatever styling selectors that you are specifying here, it's not actually a part of the static DOM. That is, it's not a part of your HTML web page structure, but it is something that is dynamically generated when the user interacts with your web page. So the way you specify that is basically using this colon character and then followed by hover. Hover indicates that whenever a user hovers their mouse over a certain element on your web page, do something about it, right? And this something that we are doing here is basically we are changing the color of the background color of these particular elements, right? So I first went here, I looked at it, and I noticed I tried to change the text color of this drop-down element. Okay, so when I tried doing that, nothing happened, nothing was showing up. So I removed this drop-down element, which was the child element, and then I tried to change the color. And still nothing was happening because something was overriding the process, right? So essentially what I realized is that this selector, which is something that we are saying that take this primary element, and if the user hovers their mouse over it, then select its child and then apply these styling rules and properties, right? But that was not happening. So I know that there is nothing wrong with my hover, okay, because I did a hover similar to this here, which allows us to essentially code the background color of all of our menu options to this color that we have selected. So I can see that this is working. So when I go to projects, it was still working, but nothing was coming here. So I know that something was wrong with the selection of my child element that was here. So as a result of this, I went back to the HTML code and I started kind of going through the process of identifying the area of the code which was causing problems for me, right? And going by it line by line, that is when I realized that this li element, which was the primary projects menu option that we see on the page here, was closed off, that this close off was happening before or without including this as a child element. And that is when I fixed it, right? And in the fixing video, you would notice that after I fixed it, I forgot to save the HTML file. So that's why when I went back to check it, it wasn't showing up again, which caused a little bit of a heart attack for me. Like at that point, it was like a, abyss, like what's next kind of scenario. And I knew everybody or one of us have faced this situation during demos, like you think you have done the right thing, but it still doesn't work. So then I hopefully, like luckily I realized that I forgot to save it. So another thing to keep in mind is please double check if you're saving your content, right? There are, of course, options in VS Studio Code that you have the option to auto save after a little bit of delay. But I personally like to keep the save with myself and then like save after every small piece of code that I write. That habit is kind of helpful. So if you don't have that habit, please make sure that you save, and whatever. So that was essentially the problem, right? Few of the learning lessons for you all, for those who are working on this for the first time, don't get discouraged when you hit problems like this. Essentially, when it comes to web programming, until we go to, let's say, things like React Native, most of the problems are typically so-called silly in nature, right? So something like this, where you have forgotten to, let's say, include the child element in the parent, or you made a typo somewhere, so it's not working properly. Most of the errors are going to be something like this, right? And in JavaScript, you will have a little bit of like programming logic error. So you can face some logical errors in that situation, but nothing too serious, right? Even for React as well, it's nothing too serious. Most of the problems you will face will be with respect to setting up the environment, sometimes a package is not installing correctly or it's not opening on your system. That is not your fault. Please remind yourself that for those who are working on this for the very first time, right? You cannot control those behaviors. That's outside of your control, right? That's not an error that you did, right? So the key to resolving these kind of problems is to make sure that you don't lose your patience, that you don't get frustrated or discouraged, or don't beat yourself up, right? Take some deep breaths, walk away from it if you're not able to solve it, if you think that your brain has frozen, right? Come back to it a little bit later with a fresh mind and start thinking about it step by step as to what you did, trace it back, and try to address it, right? React Native is a different beast, and we will talk about React Native when we get to React Native. We don't have to worry ourselves. Let's get to React first, and then we will talk about it, right? Anyways, so moving forward, before what we want to do today, and remember what we did last time. I'm of course discussing about these different styling rules specific to a particular use case that we are working on. But as we are going forward with this, we are covering different individual CSS properties as well. So this is something that you have to keep in mind, is that I'm not doing this like theory-based approach where I take every different CSS property that is there, but I'm actually showing you how to apply this and how you can make use of this. So you have to remember that one of the most important things that we discussed the last class when we were doing the styling of the Navbar is first and foremost how to apply this display flexbox, right? Flexbox is going to be one of your best friends with respect to how you position your elements on the web page and how you control the positioning, right? So the default option, always remember this, there are two ways in which you can flex things out, okay? And flex kind of by default takes care of how the positioning needs to be based on 2 or 3 different properties that is there, right? So when you set display equals to flex, the default option of the flex is a row, right? In web systems, the default option is always going to be row, because remember, if you're thinking in terms of a web app, mostly, like typically or traditionally speaking, you are dealing with, let's say, a desktop kind of screen, right? You have a big resolution screen, at least 720px wide and stuff like that, right? So that is the idea. When you come to developing mobile apps, the default flex direction is actually column. And that's kind of intuitive, right? Because cell phone screens don't have much width. What they have is the height, right? So everything is row-wise organized. You can override that, make it into a row if you want to, and you have seen many apps that does that for you as well, right? So if you do not specify, there is this property that is known as flex direction. So if you want to override the default behavior, essentially what you set this flex direction to is either column or column reverse. What does column reverse do? It's the same thing, right? Instead of going from top to bottom, the things will be arranged from bottom to top, right? So similarly, if you do a row reverse, so instead of going from left to right, the organization will start happening from right to left, whatever elements that you put inside of there, right? So this is one of the options in your flex box, but always keep this in mind. We are not using this because we are using the default behavior, so we don't have to specify that it's a row direction, right? We don't want to override that, all right? And then align items is another supporting property which plays along with flexbox. So when you say align item center, everything will be centered out when it is being arranged on your web page. And then finally, you have this justify content option. Space between means it will put as much a space that is available on the screen between these different items to which you have applied flexbox. So initially, when we applied this flexbox, we have applied it in 2 different places, right? So what we did, if you go back and think in terms of the design that we were working with, we initially have this entire navbar. Okay, so we have this nav element to which we applied flex, display flex property, right? So that means what this kind of entails is that every item that is going to be present within this container will be auto arranged based on the properties that you provide, right? And it's in the row direction, that is, everything will be arranged from left to right. So what we did is, inside of this, there was a div element that contains your logo, right? And then we had a list or unordered list element which contains all of our list items. So we had list item, list item, list item, and then this list item had like a nested list item, and then so on and so forth. So when we say space between and align items center, right, So everything will be centered out within this container. And then there are only 2 items right now. So it will put as much as space that is available between these 2 items. Okay, so that is the reason why everything gets pushed apart. The second time that we used flex was within this list item, this unordered list itself. And then we did the same thing. We centered it out, okay, use the default row direction, and then we applied space between. So whatever space is available inside this container now, every item within that will be auto arranged. Okay, so these 3 properties is what you essentially have to remember, right? There is also another trick to kind of center elements out. Okay, so if you want to center elements, there is another trick that you can use. So essentially, if you remember, there is a property called margin, and this comes from the box model, right? So the box model states that there is padding, which separates the distance between the actual content and the border. You have the border, which is essentially the bordering around it. And then finally, there is the margin, which is the separation between each element. So if you set the margin, so the margin can be thought of as having it in the y-axis and then the x-axis. So if you want to center elements out, the way you can do it is simply write these 2 values. Margin 0, auto. Remember, this is a shorthand notation. For every margin padding that you specify, you can have 4 different values, right? 2 in the x-axis, okay, and then 2 in the y-axis, right? So if I just give 2 values, so that means I am specifying it. The first value is essentially for both values of y-axis, and then the second value is for both values of the x-axis, that is right and left. So when I say something like margin is 0 and auto, so what I'm saying is the top and bottom margins are not there. I'm not putting any margins there. And when I say auto, the browser handles the space that is available on the x-axis and it centers it out. It brings it to the center location. So these are the 2 different ways in which you can center your elements within any container. I'm not saying web page, because there is a subtle difference here, because depending on where your elements are and how you would like to center, things might vary. So think about this. Can you give this a try? And can you bring this to the center of the page? Because right now, this picture it doesn't have any styling, essentially, right? So how or what would your problem solving approach be to move this to the center? Because text is pretty simple, right? And the reason why I say text is pretty simple is all I need to do in order to center a text is there is a CSS property that is known as text-align, and all I need to do is set this as center. If I do that, so let's check that out. I think we have not worked on that part yet, right? So let's say if I want to just simply do that, let's say I want to take the H1 that is present on the page and I want to center it out. So all I do is text-align and then center. So if I do this, does anything change? Yes. So that is straightforward enough. But what about images? Well, images where you can't do text-align image center, or maybe you can try it out and see what you get. Might as well work, something that I might not know. But that's straightforward, right? So let me just give it some little bit more stuff. So let's say I will do a text weight, not a text weight. Let's say give a font weight of 700. Okay, maybe I will give it a text dash shadow. Okay, and how much shadow should we give? Let's say just 2 pixels. Is that even evident? It's not, it's very light. Let's say 12 pixels, something like this, still not showing up, but that's fine. All right, let's say I want to give a text dash decoration. Okay, and then maybe like a solid line. It's not really doing much here, but that's fine. Okay, but what about this image? How can we bring this image to the center?
Can you set the margins to auto?
Okay, let's try that. Let's try that suggestion. But before we begin, let's find out where our image is, because we need to first and foremost select that image. So where is our image here? Okay, so what should I select here? Should I select, no, this is the logo. Where is my image? It should be somewhere here. Okay, here. It's in the main body. So what should I select? Should I select this image? Should I select this main? If I select this main, then I'm dealing with 3 different elements, I think. I'm dealing with an H1. Forget about all these horizontal rulings. I'm dealing with an image. I'm dealing with a paragraph. So what should I do? If I put a flex on the main, that will be not what you would like to see, because what will happen then is it will take this header, it will take this image, and it will take this person here, this paragraph here, and it will put it side by side in a row. If you put it as a column, then essentially it will come one after the other. That is also another option that you have. But if you're just trying to deal with this person, this particular element, where should I begin? What should your thought process be? Yes.
We should begin with just the image tag that contains the Mickey Mouse.png. Then we would give it a class, and then we can CSS. Then,
Okay. So yes, that is true, right? But as a practice, what I like to follow is I like to wrap it up inside a container first, right? Instead of just dealing with that image itself, I would like to create a container around that image and then deal with the container itself. And then any kind of styling that I want to apply, I will apply it to the image within the container. So nothing flows out of it, right? So that is kind of like my way of doing it. It makes things a little bit more contained and controlled rather than dealing with the individual elements, right? Where I need them. So image wise, I try to wrap it around, right? If I have too many contents, I try to wrap it around the container. That's what I go by with, right? So what I do is I create a div, and here I give a class name or an ID, whatever you want to do, right? Essentially where I will say portfolio, something intuitive you can give, portfolio image wrapper, something that will make sense. Always make sure that your namings actually makes sense for you to come back to it, as well as if somebody else works with your project or code, they don't, well, curse you, so to speak, right? So essentially I wrap this around, and now let's work with the div class, right? So one of the suggestions that was given was to set the margin as 0 and auto. So let's see that if we select this person, go back to our navigation, okay, dot, and then paste it, because that's how you refer to class names. And then the suggestion was margin and then 0, auto. Now, how many of you think this will work? Raise of hands. Will this work? Yes or no? No? Just one no. What about online students? Do you think this will work? Somebody already checked it? No, you haven't checked it. Okay, so essentially this does not work. So what should you do?
Would be a line item center.
Align item center. Okay. All right, let's try that then. This suggestion did not work. So what you want to do, the next suggestion that came is display flex align items center. Anything else? Okay. So that doesn't work either. And the reason why display flex doesn't work is because how many items are we dealing with? Just a single item, right? So it will put it in the row itself. So that is not working out. So what should you do?
Would the first one work if we set the display to black?
Will the first one work if we set the display to work? Okay, let's try that out. It's all about trial and error. So let's try it. Okay. So I would like to move this after this. Okay. Few things to note for this suggestion, for the last suggestion. What is the default category of div? What type of HTML tag is this? Is it a block tag or is it an inline tag? Anyone remembers? Everybody remembers block versus inline tags, right? That's the first thing, right? So block tags essentially puts a new line before and after, and you can control the width and height of the block tag. Inline tag, the width and height is basically the size of the content that you put inside of it. And then you don't have a new line before and after. So anything after an inline tag will appear in the same line as long as there is space. So image is an inline tag, yes, but div is a block tag. So it already carries the block option. So what can you do?
What are we trying to accomplish here?
Move this image to the center of the page.
If you make the wrapper have 100% width, like 100% of the width page, then the flex box will work.
Okay, so the last suggestion is you set the width to 100%. Okay, and then instead of using the display as block, the suggestion now is you keep the flex and then align items to center. Let's remove this margin. And boom. Still doesn't work. So note here, this is a good learning experience. Don't worry about it. You don't always think about the end goal. It's the learning that you are receiving through the process is also means a lot, right? So here, one of the things that you have to note here, the width equals to 100%. You can put it on the image itself, and what it does, suggestion that was made here, what this thing specifically does, and you can do the same thing for the height as well. When you specify 100% of something, it will kind of take that entire space within that container. So what happens now is instead of thinking about it this way, let's say if we can check this out or not. Let's say I put a background color of some color. I don't know if it will show up or not. So look at how much this div is spanning. Now, do you notice what is happening and why things are not working? Let's remove this for a second and see what the situation looks like. Do you notice this? Pay attention to what we are looking at right now. If I color the div, this is the entirety of the div right now, because the div takes up all of the space that is available on the screen right now. If I set the width to, let's say, 50 pixels or something like this, then you would see probably a very smaller margin of your div, because it's a block tag by default, so you can control the width and the height. So anytime you try to center the div itself will not be centered because the div has already taken up everything, right? So it is not a problem with the div. Whatever you guys are suggesting, it's not wrong. It's just being applied to something that cannot do what you're asking it to do. Does everybody follow this discussion, right? So this was a good learning experience, because the other thing that you have to keep in mind that whenever you set something up to 100%, okay, when you set the width or when you set the height to 100%, it takes up the entire coverage area that is available, right? So instead of doing all of this,
Professor,
yes, sir.
what if you use justify content center?
Okay, let's try that. Justify content center. Good enough? Okay,
Yes.
so do we need to comment out anything? Let me see. Okay. All right. So that's the last piece of the puzzle, because now when you apply flex, it will flex the item inside of it. Okay. So that is the reason why you need to keep in mind that this is how flex boxes work. You have to think about, where did we go? Where's my pen? Here. Always remember flex boxes in this way. Whenever this is your container, and this container could be a div, could be any other HTML element which has additional child elements. Okay. So whenever you apply flex to this, all right, the flex will auto arrange every element that you have inside of it based on how you specify the arrangement. So that means the how you specify the arrangement will be in terms of the direction, that is whether it will be row reverse, column, or column reverse. That's one of the options. And then there are two supporting properties of flex that are very make things in terms of layout very flexible. No pun intended. Right? So what you have to keep in mind is these two supporting properties that helps your display flex is basically this align items. If you do it centering, then everything comes to the center. And then if you justify the content, remember in Microsoft Word, there is left write, center, and then justify when you write the paragraphs. Remember that? Does anybody remember that, right? So when you justify everything, everything is like auto-arranged, right? All the sentences are auto-arranged, right? So if you write these 3 lines of code, 106, 105, and 102 together, that is basically the recipe of bringing anything to the center. Okay. But here, when we did the menu, pay attention, we did not want to center it out. We wanted to spread it apart. So we used another property, which was basically how you are going to put the space. So here we didn't want to center it. We wanted to put spaces, right? So you can always check the different available values and you can make a reference sheet for yourself, because this is one of the go-to CSS styling rules that you will use very often, no matter what project you're doing, right? And makes your life a little bit easier. So you always have to keep that in mind, okay? So also a few things to note here when you're working with, let's say, image, and maybe we can remove this color. I have been using this way too much. Okay, so another thing to note is that there is another property called object fit, and this is specifically with respect to images. Okay, so when you set object fit, there are a few options that is available to you, and this is again with respect to images only. When an image is present inside a container, and then it does not fill everything up, right? Not the div container itself. If you put contain, right, the first option that you see on the screen, that will not allow the image, if it is bigger than the container's size, to bleed out of it. Do you follow what I'm saying? Right? So that is basically what contain does. Cover will basically just keep it as a cover page, retaining the original resolution of the image. Fill will basically fill it out. And if you do not apply anything, that's the same as not writing object fit essentially in itself, right? So this, if you want an analogy of something that you have done before, think about it this way. Have you ever worked with changing the desktop background with images of your choice and liking? But sometimes the size of your PC or screen is not the same as the image that you like, the resolution, right? So whenever you set it as an image, let's say, does somebody recall my background image when I use my computer? No, the dark side and Superman face off. Nobody remembers that. Anyways, I'll show you next time. That image is not spanning across the entirety of the screen, but there are options that Windows provide where you can do fill, where you can do repetitions, right? And the image, depending on the size and the resolution, will behave the same way. So that is what object fit does. Okay, so similarly, there is also an option that you can do here that is known as background image. And then what you can do is provide URL. So this is how you provide URL in CSS. Right, so essentially within this, as a string, now you can write whatever URL. So if you want to bring any kind of external source, resources, but put it in URL. So this is one of the options. Another option that essentially people use is basically the Google API fonts. So typically there are 2 options in which you can integrate Google API fonts. So let me just check here. Okay. All right. So what you can do is that Google has its own set of fonts that is available to you, right? So when you go there, it gives you this URL option, and then this URL that you have. So instead of setting a default font that just the browser supports, what you can do is you can copy these links that is available. And what you can do, you have 2 options. Either you can put it as a CSS property, just like we talked about here, by using the URL option, okay? Or the secondary option that you have in order to kind of link these URLs that Google provides is essentially to link it in the header part of your HTML file itself. Does that make sense? So this is how you can bring external files, and a lot of projects you will see uses these Google fonts and not like the default browser fonts, because there are some funky, quirky, and nice looking classical fonts that is available in Google, right? So that kind of suits your needs based on the type of application that you're trying to implement. It can do that. So again, remember two options. You can either use the link tag within the head section of your HTML file, and then in the href, you can provide the link that Google provides. That is one of the options. Or what you can do is you can simply go to your CSS file, okay? And then here you can put the font family and then put a URL instead of choosing the font family. So remember when we were setting font family, we had all of these default options that your browser supports, right? So instead of choosing any one of these, what you can do is simply you can URL it and then put the HTTPS link that is provided from Google, right? And wherever your page loads, there is no problem because the client's browser will essentially connect with Google and bring that in. So you're not going to miss out on it, so to speak, because here there is a problem that, oh, what if this first one, which I cannot pronounce, is not present in the browser, right? So you go to the second one, the third one. Essentially, the worst case scenario is none of it supported by the browser. Maybe the client is using a very outdated browser, right? There is a possibility. So in that situation, the default browser and your user experiences will be degraded because of that reason. So don't keep it in the hands of the user. That's the best option that you have, right? So use Google Fonts. That's one of the available options. All right. So let's come back to our discussion with respect to our Navbar. What we want to do now is essentially, we want to continue the Navbar discussion. And I want to talk to you about responsive design. And we discuss the motivation behind responsive design as to what it means, what it does. So what we essentially want to do, if we go back to our oakland.edu, which is my favorite when it comes to HTML discussions, well, it serves the purpose, right? Open dev tool, wires, come on, Edge, right? So here we talked about the fact that when the screen size keeps on reducing, pay attention to the top right corner. When I move this window, you can see that the screen size is changing, right? The resolution of the screen size. Once it hits a certain point, let's see what that certain point is. Here. So the moment it goes below around 600 by 600, right? Then this menu that we saw previously changes to a hamburger menu option. So you have to click on that option and that shows you the rest of the options, right? So this category of programming, web programming, is known as responsive web design. So the responsive part essentially encapsulates what we are trying to do, that it responds to the behavior of changing screen size, right? Of course, the viewport is one of the options that you find in your HTML code itself. So the HTML here has a viewport option at the beginning within the head section, and the viewport's initial scale 1.0 determines or tells the browser to use whatever available space is there, right? But the problem is, this is the available space that you have right now. But if you go back and look at our website, what is this? No. All right, if you come to our website that we are trying to design, okay, you see our viewport is also there, but our menu is not behaving like that anymore. You can see that the content below is kind of changing, and you can see that it is kind of taking it. The reason why that is happening is because the block tag is using the available space. So that is responding to the changes in the screen size, and it keeps on going and going until it can no longer reduce itself, right? I believe that there is no cell phone that is smaller than this width. But you can see everything is behaving, but our menu is not behaving the way that OU's menu is behaving, right? So we need to make that responsive. And in order to do that, we should be able to identify how the screen size is changing, provide a threshold value that if it goes below that threshold value, then you need to change the menu option that is available here. Is that clear? So that is basically known as responsive web design. And the way that it is implemented is through a CSS concept that is known as media queries. So media essentially is referring to the device that is accessing it. Don't think of media as multimedia like audio, video file. That's not the media that is represented. The media basically is the device that is accessing it. So when you're doing media queries, you're trying to find out the width and the height of the resolution of the device that is accessing it, specify a threshold value, and then when it crosses below that threshold value, you implement this hamburger menu. That is what responsive, because you need some sort of a if-else kind of behavior in order to do responsive web design. Okay, but there is no way to write if-else statements in CSS per se. So what it does allow us to do is to essentially implement media queries. Okay, so in order to do the media queries, remember there is a hack. There are better ways, of course, but this is the most easiest way for those who are starting it. Here, if you notice, I had set up this placeholder area in order to do the responsive navbar design, right? So I will uncomment this. Well, when I say uncomment this, I do not want it to uncomment what is already commented. Good God. Okay. And I think it doesn't like this part here. Everything else looks good. Yeah, everything else looks good. So what I want to do is basically, this is just for the labeling, that is presentation part of it. The hamburger, the 3 lines options, you can import it from external packages that gives you icons, right? To make it look more, I don't know, fancy, if that's the term that you like. But this is the default rendering of the browser for the hamburger menu, right? Now this checkbox is going to behave as the controlling entity that will enable or disable the viewing of this hamburger. Okay, so that is the whole idea around it that we want to implement. All right, so the first thing that we need to do is basically select this input attribute. All right, so the first new thing that we are going to learn is another way of selecting different elements. So notice here, and this is kind of similar, that this is an input tag, right? So if you just use the tag names, you will specify input. But let's come to this contact me page. All right, and let's go and down and check this. So here, how many inputs do you have? A lot, right? But notice that some of the inputs are text type, some of them are email. You can also put password, file upload, image upload, date, time, and all those kind of behavior, right? So how do you, instead of giving class names and IDs, how do you still choose an input tag, but for a specific type? Do you understand the problem that I'm referring to, right? So the way you do that is by selecting or specifying the selector for tag name and attribute together. Pay close attention to what I said. So we will specify the selector, not just for the tag name, but the tag name and its attribute. So this is attribute-based selectors, right? So the way you do that is after the tag name, you specify third brackets, and within the third brackets, you specify the attribute that you're trying to select. So for example, here in our index.html, what is my tag name? Input. What is my attribute? Checkbox. So when I specify the selector, what I'm going to do is first write input, and then in third brackets, I'm going to specify checkbox. Okay, so this is how you are going to be specifying attribute-based selectors. So anytime you have to select a specific attribute of a tag name, this is how you do it, right? You specify it within the third brackets. And what happens after that is pretty straightforward. Inside the curly braces, you apply whatever styling that you want. Yes, sir.
If you want to apply the styling to a tag with different attributes, like instead of just a checkbox, you want to do it with something else.
Like
just do comma separated.
Yes, comma separated. Right. If you want to, only if all the styling rules that you write here, whatever you write here, is applicable to all of them universally. If it's not, then you have to separate it out. Does that make sense? Right. So let's say here, let's take an example. That was a good question. Let's say you wanted to apply certain set of stylings that is applicable to both email and text, but there is also some distinction between text and email. Let's hypothetically assume this scenario. So now if I wanted to do this, all I wanted to do, or all I have to do, is basically put a comma here, put input, and then put email. But nothing will happen here because this particular style sheet is only attached to the index.html file currently, right? You can change that later on, right? So just keep in mind that if multiple styling rules needs to be applied to multiple elements, just separate it by comma. Okay, if you separate it by a white space, what it indicates is that the second element is the child to the first element. Okay, and then there is another character, I forgot the technical name of it. So if you write something like this, H1P. So what this means that H1 is the parent element, and then select the paragraph which is a direct descendant of H1. Direct descendant, that means it has to be connected. If I simply write H1 white space P, then what it indicates is for a parent that is H1, select all the paragraphs that is its child. It doesn't matter at which level the child is. It could be a direct son or daughter. It could be a grandchild, granddaughter, right? Or great grand. You can continue that line, right? But essentially, this is the white space. That's what the white space does. Okay. Then we have already learned about how to do the class name, the ID, and then just the tag name. And this is the last of the selectors, which is the attribute-based selectors. And that covers all the different types of selectors that you can have in CSS. So there are three basic: class name, ID, tag name, and then parent-based. You have two options. One is all child, one is direct descendant. So that's 5. And then this is the 6th one, which is attribute-based selectors. That's all the selectors. Actually, no, that is not all the selectors. There is one more, which is to select the sibling. What if two nodes are side by side and you want to apply it? What you do for that is you use this plus symbol. So when you use this plus symbol, so can somebody interpret what this is trying to select? Give it a try based on the discussion that we just had. Which is the parent element? Whatever this class name is pointing to or referring to. Then what does it say? What is the next thing? There is a white space. So that means what does this is trying to do? So it's telling us that for this parent, select the list items, which are its child and its sibling list items. Do you follow? So this is just a 2-level distinction. So the first is parent, all its children, and those children's sibling, which are also li.
So if there was no plus sign there, would it just be 2 list items that are?
Then it doesn't make sense, right? Because then you're selecting all list items.
Yeah.
Then you don't have to do li space li. It doesn't really make sense. What you can do is, however, let's say if you want the list item, which is a direct descendant of all the list items, which are descendant of drop down at any level, then you can do that greater than symbol. I keep forgetting what the name is. But yeah, but that is one way of specifying it, and it sounds reasonably conceptual, right? But you don't do space and space. You can, but as long as it is separate. If you want to do that, if you have a situation, right? But whenever you see a plus sign in the selector, remember the next thing that follows the plus sign is actually the sibling of the left-hand element of the plus sign, right? So all you have is 7 different ways of specifying selectors. So if you think of it this way, things simplify down a lot, but you have to keep revising this. Otherwise you will forget. That is important. All right, let's move on. So we select the input checkbox, and what do we need to do first? So if we go back and let's see what is the condition of our website here. Let's remove our developer tools. So what should we do right now? Okay, so let me pose this question in this way. Should this be visible? Do you see this when you see this? No, right? So how do I remove this? We did the same thing for our drop-down menu actually. Because you see this project 1, 2, 3, 4 window or division container that you see is actually a part of the HTML code, but when the page loads, it is not visible. Right? So we need to do the same thing for our checkbox here as well, because this is just a tool to control the menu options. we want to hide it, right? So the way I want to hide it is by setting the display to none, not the visibility as hidden, because if you do visibility hidden, you cannot see it on the page, but it's still present. So the space here will be actually taken up. But when you set display none, it is not a part of the DOM to begin with when the page renders, right? So any space here or any element you kind of style around this element, that space is available to you. That's the difference, right? So it's like Harry Potter wearing an invisibility cloak. That's visibility hidden. He's still there, you just can't see it. Right, so that's one of the ways you can remember or remind yourself what is the difference between display none and visibility hidden. This is one of the typical, like very common interview questions that you get, because this is a trick question essentially, right? Because literally, if you think without knowing, it means the same thing. You don't know what's the difference, right? So that is why you have to pay special attention to these trap questions. All right, so what I want to do is go back to my code. Okay. And set the display to none. Okay, so the moment I do that, where does it go? Okay, this should vanish, which is not, but we'll come back to this and let's see why this is behaving the way that it is behaving. And I know why it is behaving because I have made a typo here. Well, I've not made a typo, it was a syntactical error. You have to have type and then checkbox. Please make a correction here. I made a mistake with the syntax that you simply don't write the checkbox. You essentially write type equals, and then within the string, you specify what type you're dealing. Okay, so that's just a syntactical error. All right, so now it's gone. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is basically set the control to this hamburger option. Okay, right now this hamburger option does not do anything. There is no functionality that is associated with it, right? So similarly, how we hovered over the projects icon, added some functionality associated with it by showing these subheaders or sub icons, we basically need to now tie up this hamburger to the width of the screen by doing a media query essentially, and then putting all of this menu inside the control feature of the hamburger icon. That is essentially the steps that we need to follow, right? So the default thing that we need to do is also hide our hamburger. So where is our hamburger? Here. By default, this will never show up on the screen. It will only show up if the screen size goes below a certain point. So what I'm doing right now is setting up the default behavior. That is, once the screen opens up in, let's say, a web system, how should it behave? So it should not be shown. That is what the behavior is. So dot hamburger, that is basically my class name. I also would want to set its display to none, okay, because I don't want to show it when it is there. Maybe we can increase the size of it. You can use one of these categorical labels, or what I can do is maybe, how big do you think that Oakland menu is? Let's say 28 pixels. Okay, and then the final thing that we want to do is use this option called user selection, or whether the user can select it or not, and we need to set it to none. That is, the user cannot essentially interact with this at this point of time. Once you set all of this up, everything will vanish. That is what we want. When the default behavior is present, that is, this website opens on a desktop screen, we don't want anything to show. So the next logic that we want to implement is, when do we want it to show? And then connect the menu to the functionality. Okay, so that's the two-step process you always need to remember. In responsive web design, there are always two fronts. What is the normal behavior and what is the intended responsive behavior? So what you see right here, the two pieces of styling rules that we have applied, is the normal intended behavior. That is when this website opens up in a desktop with sufficient width. Okay, so going forward, the next thing that we want to do, so let me just write this down. Styling for responsive CSS Navbar. Here you will see default behavior of hamburger menu. Okay. And then here you will do responsive behavior through CSS media queries. Okay, that is how you need to essentially implement the media queries. So the syntax for media queries is media, okay, and then followed by that you will have a kind of like a function call. Okay, so it's basically a prototype that is available to us. So where do we stop? So essentially, keep in mind the typical size of your website, not website, your PC screens, okay, is at 768 pixels. Okay, remember, anytime you see an image, it starts at around 1024p x 768p, and then it keeps on increasing from there. You have 1280p and stuff like that. You don't need to remember this. The more you work with this, the more it will come to you, right? But know that 1024 cross 768 is like where it starts, a typical PC size, right? Some of the laptop screens which are 13 inches and above also have this resolution as well. So what I want to do is I want to set the max width. That's basically where we are setting our threshold, and we want to set that to 768 pixels. Okay, let me sit down. All right. So once you do that, once this is the resolution, then you need to tie up the behavior that you want to execute when you see that the screen size, the width is basically 768 pixel. So what I need to address here, I'll just refer to my code at this point of time, is remember, and this whole media query needs to wrap all the behavior that will be executed from the media query. So think of what I'm doing right now, similar to writing a function. It's just that the syntax is a little bit different, right? So the way I want to treat the menu is I want to set its display to none. Okay, and I will explain all of this once I do this. I will set its position to absolute, because we are essentially tying up the child to that hamburger menu. Remember when we did the project and then the sub menu, the drop down menu, right? We had a parent and then the whole box of the sub menu was the child, right? So how did we achieve that? We set the parent as relative and then the child as absolute. So here we need to take that entire menu and put it inside the hamburger option, so that when you click the hamburger option, it will actually show up, right? So I can, right now we don't have the click option because we are not doing JavaScript, right? But if I hover over the hamburger menu, then we can make it to show. So we have to use that same logic here, is that we have to set something as absolute and relative as well, and make a parent-child relationship, right? So right now, if you look where our menu is, where is it? Where are you? Where are you? Where is my class menu? Menu here. So this is where the Navbar menu option starts. So I need to wrap this entire div, which is identified by this class, and that is what this dot menu is doing, under the hamburger, right? So that is what I want to set. So I set its position to absolute. Okay, you can give it a background color if you would like. Let's say does anybody remember what we used? I don't know. So I'll just use what I have on my notes here. And then we will set the right margin, not the margin, but the space that is available on the right to 0. Okay. And then we will also set the left space to 0. Remember, there are 4 options: the space in the top, space in the bottom, left and right as well, right? So you simply write left and right, then I'm just controlling the spacing in the x-axis. Always think x and y axis. And this thought process you need to start developing right now, because when you move to frameworks, CSS frameworks, they don't necessarily deal with left, right, top, bottom. I mean, they do, of course, they're built on top of CSS, but the way they explain it, they always use axis. They say x-axis, they say y-axis, right? So they make things more shorter that way. Instead of dealing with 4, you deal with 2 always, unless you need to deal with 4. Okay. So after that, you want to center things out. So the way you want to do it is you set the text align to center itself. And then just for aesthetic purposes, I gave some padding, and this is something that I figured out how to do it. There is no magic in this. This is just trial and error. So don't get too overwhelmed or surprised. Whenever you're seeing these unit values, remember these unit values is something that someone has done, checked, decided that, okay, this looks decent enough, right? So similarly, the way I'm saying this is you can look at this and you can say, no, maybe I need the block to go a little bit lower, right? So what do? You give a separation, maybe a margin of this content and this content. If you push the margin down, so that means you have to give a margin for this whole div block or whatever this block is, a margin top. If you give a margin top, that means it will separate this from whatever is at the top. So that is one of the ways you can do that, right? If that doesn't work, check out how else you can do it, right? You already know the properties that is used to push things around. Trial and error is something that you have to deal with. That is why for CSS, you don't get it right in the first shot. HTML, yes, you know, logical, right? But this is mostly about artwork through code. So you have to see what works for you. And the best way is to not having to start from scratch. There is nothing wrong in adopting something that you like and then making it your own when you're working with things like this. And people have shared their own templates. If you Google CSS template for portfolio page, CSS template for product e-commerce page, people share their template. You start from there and then change it. Don't forget to change it. Otherwise, your website will look as the same as somebody else's, right? You don't want to do that. It's not called plagiarism per se, but it just looks bad on you as a developer. That's the only difference. Okay, so learn the basics, adopt some things, use that as a template, and then start from there. Okay, so again, as a reminder, don't get, for those who are doing this for the first time, don't get overwhelmed by these values. These values is something that you have to try and test or adopt from somewhere and then go from there. Always remember it this way. Okay, all right. So the next thing that we want to do is basically put some behavior. Remember, we cannot do a click like we did for the Oakland because the click requires JavaScript. Okay, or HTML attributes, but it's not suggested. There is an HTML attribute called onClick, which mimics the behavior of JavaScript event listeners, right? What happens when you do a click or type something and those kind of behaviors. It is absolutely not recommended to put JavaScript or CSS in HTML. That is just a bad way of coding. Okay, unless that's just a one-time thing and you need to use it, then it's fine. Okay, understandable. You don't want to create an entire style sheet for just a single piece, but don't do it overall. You're not going to get that internship or job if you show that that's how you implement it, right? So for first-time learners, separate JS, CSS from HTML. That's basically the good coding standards. So the next thing that I want to do is basically put the not the menu, but menu. Okay, behavior. So I want to select the menu, and I want to take the list items that is present in the menu, which basically are all of my list items. And then I want to put a pseudo class that is a hover behavior. Okay, so the way the hover behavior works, or what I want to do is I want to change the display, and this time let's use a new display just to learning. Inline block. Remember what inline block does is it changes the block behavior to an inline behavior, and it still allows us to control the width and the height. So that is the best of the both worlds. What I mean by best of the both worlds is case by case, of course. That is, if you want the content to be in the same line, you want it inline. But if you still want to be able to control its width and height, you still want to be its block. So what do? You merge them together and you create inline block, right? So the next thing that you can do is probably give it some, aesthetic display. You can give it some background color. Let's try out a different way of specifying background color. For those who are new, let's use what is known as the hex code. Okay, so I will give some kind of hex code here, 4C, 9E, I think 4C after that as well. All right. So this is another way of writing color. You can use the hash symbol followed by 6 characters, which represents your hex code. And it's the same as this. So if you look at this, right, there is an RGB option at the very top of the screen, the pop-up that opened up, right? So red, blue, and green, or red, green, blue, sorry, not red, blue, and green, RGB, right? So essentially, if I change things around here, you can see that the number is changed. So this is how you can select the palette. You can start with a simple color and you can select your palette. Once you select your palette, the standard way of specifying it is not through the name of the color. Again, for getting an internship, getting a job, don't use direct color names. You need to show some form of understanding about at least how the hex code works or this RGB code works. So there are online tools available like CSS color selector. What you do is when you open that website, it gives you this palette itself. You select your color, move it around, check the code, put it here. You don't have to remember the numbers. You cannot. That is simply just possible, right? Another suggestion, there are two suggestions that I want to give you in terms of coloring your website. First thing is never use 000 and 255, 255, 255. That means do not use pure white or pure black. The reason behind this is in the real world, nothing is absolutely white and absolutely black. It is something in between. So there, even if you do, let's say, if you want a white color, don't do 000, okay? Essentially do something like 010. Put some form of shade to it, okay? The other thing is, let me see if I can show you this example here. This is something that I learned, not Gucci Mane. All right, so the other thing that I have learned from like looking around and stuff like that is how, let's come here and see if we can. Okay, how these different websites, designer websites, can you tell me another brand? No, I need something that is like a branded website, unfortunately. What is not channel? What is the name of it?
Sure.
How do you spell that?
Yeah, I think it's CH.
CH ANEL. I don't know who these people are, but Chanel bags. Okay. There is a trend, actually, what I'm trying to get at is notice the difference or notice the similarity between these two websites, right? Notice how, of course, there is a funky thing going on here, but notice the coloring, essentially, right? So you only have one background color and one text color that is matching their products, right? If you do the same thing for Gucci as well, you will notice the same thing. You have a very simplistic color here, okay? The contrast is clear, and hopefully this is not black and white, but don't do that. But there is a tip on how you can make your products look more expensive. I mean, not the actual materialistic products that you sell, but for you as a developer, your product is your website or your web app. So the suggestion that developers gives us is that always use 3 comparatively muted colors. Don't use anything that is too funky, like a neon color. God, don't do that, right? Use something that is a little bit muted in nature and just use 3 color palettes that are complementing each other. Always remember this suggestion. Use something that is muted and no more than 3 different color palettes. So here, how many do you see? I see just 2 mostly, right? So actually I see 3. Do you see 3 as well? So I have the blackish tone for the menu, which is contrasting with the color that is white. And then inside of this, we have the grayish looking background for all the items. Throughout the website, you will not see anything funky going on. Okay, try to follow this suggestion when you're working with or when you're trying to make your product look a little bit more expensive. Okay, there are also certain sites, CSS color palette generator. So you can go to this website. I kind of like this one. It's known as Coolers. Anyways, so what you can do is it gives you the option for a lot of different color generation, right? So if you start the generator here, it will take some time and I will just close this. So what happens is when you select a particular color, right, and you hit space bar, it will start generating all these different palettes for you on your website. So what you can do is, let's say I like this one. I lock this, and then I hit a space bar again, and then it will select the best next colors that matches the first color, right? So let's say we like something like this. We lock it, hit space bar again, lock it, space bar again. Let's find something that kind of catches our eyes. Maybe this, and then final lock, and let's put it this. So once you get this, what you see below here are the hex codes, right? So now you have your palette generated completely based on what you need. So remember, there are many tools available, right? You need to know the conceptual foundations of your coding, but once you know the conceptual foundation, because now if you didn't know how to put colors in your CSS, of course you won't be able to do this, right? So all these tools comes after you have a conceptual foundation of what you're working with, right? And this is how you can design your website. Designing is more of a, I wouldn't say, the more you do it, of course, with experience, you will get better with it. But as a beginner, these things improve the way you can pick up things and make it look good, right? All right, so moving on with our digression, well, not moving on with it, but stopping it right there, is once we set this, the next thing that we want to do is apply a transition. Remember, this is basically similar to like a PowerPoint presentation. When it changes slides, is we give a timing of how long it will take to move from one to the other, and then what is going to be the type of transition. So we don't want to do anything funky. We just want to essentially put this, all right? After this, we want to apply the same things that we did when we did the drop-down menu. We want to apply it to its sibling as well. So we select our menu option, we select the list item, and then all its siblings, all right? And then just give it an aesthetic aspect, which is to give some separation of the menu that will follow below the hamburger icon. Okay, we need to create some separation, and that is what we are doing right now. We are essentially creating a separation between the list items that is going to follow one after the other, all right? And after that, the next thing that we want to do is we need to actually enable the functionality of displaying the hamburger menu icon. Remember, in the default behavior, we have hidden it, right? We have checked both display to none. So essentially, what we did here, the first three styling rules was how will the menu behave, right? But we need to connect all of this together to that hamburger icon itself, right? So in order to do that, the first thing that I want to take is go back to my input, okay? And then I know that the type that I want to work with is basically my checkbox. Okay, and then I want to apply to it another pseudo class behavior that is checked. That is a pseudo class behavior that is only applicable to checkboxes, right? You can hover over it, of course, you can do that, but the only check thing that you can do is either with radio buttons or with checkboxes itself, right? And then what I want to do is give this option, that is, this is tying up the checked behavior with the menu itself. And what I want to do in terms of styling is want to set the display to block, essentially. That is, if the input type is checked and the menu becomes block display, right? So that is what it is essentially saying. And we have to do the same set of things also for our hamburger menu. Okay, we need to set the display to block in order to make it visible. Okay, and then remember, there is a little child that has not been touched yet, because all we worked on right now was the entire menu. But remember, the menu itself has another menu inside of it, right? So we need to take this whole container that you see here and apply the same set of styling rules that we did for the parent menu. So I'm going to select the drop-down menu at this point of time, okay? And then I'm going to add some styling properties that will just position it around, nothing else. I'm not changing the behavior. The behavior has been already taken care of before. We worked on that before, right? So all I need to do is now adjust the positioning when it is kind of associated with the hamburger menu icon, because that will change the look of the page altogether. So what you're going to see now is mostly with respect to positioning the drop down menu itself and nothing else. So I'm just going to give it some space to the left, and I'm going to give it some space at the top, right? How did I come to know this? By testing it out. Okay, this is not some magic. This is not me knowing it. I did the same thing that you would do as well. Put it there, figure out how it looks, then change the values. Okay, so always keep telling yourself, first time, not users, but programmers who are looking at this, don't get overwhelmed when you see this recording and you see these values and you tell yourself, hey, I don't know where to get these values or how he decided these values. Neither did I when I began with this, right? You have to try it out and see how it looks and then go forward with it. Okay, sometimes you will miss it. Sometimes you will realize, oh, I need to do this. As long as you know what you want to do, you can find it. That's the philosophy that you need to have. All right, so let's put some space on the top. Okay, I'll put around 30 pixels. And then there is a new property that we are going to learn, which is to give some sort of animation behavior. Not transition. Transition is basically what happens when one thing changes to another. How does the transition happen? But there is another property in CSS, which is known as transformation, and that specifically is the animation part of CSS, right? So you know there is an animation where you can move a thing around the page when you do certain action. So here that certain action is, if I hover over the hamburger menu, the whole menu is going to come below it. So I'm transforming what is there on my page to a new location. So that is the transform property, all right? And the transform property, what I want to do is I want to translate it in the X direction. Translate means linearly moving it in the X direction, all right? So pay attention. Can somebody tell me why we are moving the drop-down menu in the X direction? Can you relate to the logic of what we are trying to implement? Because think about what will happen here. If I click this, this opens up. How did it open up? How did the menu move? It moved in the X-axis. It moved in this direction, right? So now think one step further. What do we have here? We have, this might not behave the same way. It actually has stopped showing the drop-down menus if you pay attention. So that is one thing that you can improve here. But for us, what do we have? We have a drop-down menu, right? So that means when this actual menu shows up, and when you hover over, let's say, the drop-down menu needs to be shown to the right-hand side of the screen. Or if you want to change the behavior, then you need to move it downwards, y-axis or x-axis, right? So let's see if we can do that. For some reason, I'm getting this vibe that I have to debug this as well, right? All right. Anyways, so once the drop-down menu is done, the last thing is actually to show the drop-down menu. That is when I hover over the parent project icon, it needs to show the drop-down menu. So I need to select the drop-down menu. And from the drop-down menu, I need to select the list items. That is a part or child of the drop-down menu. And inside of that, I do a simple aesthetic thing to it. And let me say I give the same color that is there. Maybe you can change it a little bit, but that's fine. Actually, I will change it a little bit. Okay, maybe instead of 4C, I'll put 4.4. A slight variation. It's not showing up that well. So let's do 6. Okay, a little bit of darker shade of green grayish value. Okay, so after this, no, it's okay. It's not time yet, is it? No, still at 10 minutes. All right, so this is essentially what we need to do. Now, first, let's check if it actually works or not. And let's see. All right, so it is working as intended. So notice that the media query is 768. So the moment we cross 768, the actual menu pops up. So here, another option. So this is the first, let's go line by line. By default, I have hidden my input checkbox and my hamburger menu icon. That is the default behavior. Nothing should show up when the screen size is complete. That is, it's representing a desktop. Responsive behavior, the way you implement media queries is using the syntax @media, and it's like a function call. So within the first brackets, you provide what your parameters are. The parameter that I want to follow is when the screen's max width changes. You can create multiple blocks here if you want to create multiple different behaviors for different screens. So for example, if you want to do a behavior for, let's say, a laptop 13-inch screen versus a tablet, which is 10 inches, versus a cell phone, which is 6 inches, right? Find out what the screen resolution is, and then you can write multiple CSS media queries, and it will respond according to what you have written. The next thing that I want to do is style up my menu when this goes below max width of 768, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the original menu, which is this whole thing that you see right now, because this is above 768 width, and I'm hiding that. So that is the reason why when I reduce the screen size to right below 768, the original menu disappears. That original menu is disappearing because of this block of code, right? The display is being set to none. Then I'm setting the position to absolute. Remember, the child is always absolute. The parent is always relative. So who becomes the parent when the child vanishes and becomes absolute? This person here, right? So this is the person that is going to behave that way. This is not the best color. Yeah, okay. All right. So anyways, going back, this vanishes. All right. So now when you hover over it, this is the background color that you see. The transition that happens when you get this, that is a 0.3 seconds transition and easing away. All right. I apply some margins to all the list items that is present in the menu, the sibling list items. So this is the margin that you see, because now I have to create separation between them. Remember, there was no margin li. When it was together, we just used flexbox. Life was easy, right? You can actually, as a self exercise, try doing this using the flexbox and flex direction column. You can achieve that same behavior, by the way, just to keep in mind, right? So try it out. It's a little bit of an intermediate level exercise for those who are starting to work on this for the first time, but it will be a fun exercise. What I want to do is then set this action that when the input box is checked, then set the display to block. So that is what is happening, is this is the input box being checked. When I click on this, this is actually triggering this part. And display being blocked is actually showing it. So when I click this, the input box is being checked and the menu item is setting a display to block. That is why you see it. When you uncheck it, it goes away because the display block goes away again, right? So that is the hacking behavior that we did here. The hamburger menu is set to display block as well when the width reduces below 768. That's why you're seeing this hamburger menu right now. I also increased the default size of the font size of the hamburger menu. You can use better icon packages externally that are available, okay? And then for the drop-down menu in particular, I do a transformation by moving the drop-down menu to the x-axis by 35%. So where that is happening, so when I hover over this, you see how this is coming to the side. But originally, if you remember, this was just dropping down, but now you can say it is dropping side, right? It's just not dropping bars. That's the only difference, right? If anybody get that joke. All right. And then I just add some color as to what the drop-down menu's color will look like when I hover over it. That's all that there is to it, right? So you can change all of these different. So this color, the last color that you see is when I go over each of these, you can see that the color variation is a little bit darkish tinge of green compared to the teal color background that is there. So this is the last piece of code that is happening here. Okay, so that essentially covers responsive design, CSS transformations. All right, anything else that we did that was new today? We also learned about different selected types. Okay, and the main thing that you need to remember, and this is going to be a very good friend of yours when you are doing responsive CSS behavior, is media queries. Okay, and I did it just for one screen size as a self exercise to practice this again. What you can do is you can go and you can look for screen width and height for different devices. and maybe CSS. Okay, you see these are the different available widths you have for mobile devices, tablets and iPads. You have laptop with a small screen, laptop with a large screen, desktop, extra large devices. Essentially, if you read between the lines, what things boil down to is if you are trying to develop a web system which is responsive in nature to different devices, all you need to do is write CSS media queries for each of these max. That's it, right? So try it out. Maybe you can try transforming this and making it a little bit more different, making it your own for this screen size. So the next width, max width that you give is not 768, but 480p, right? And try something different, see how it looks, change the behavior. So work with the same code, but just a new line addition. All right, so I'll wrap up here, and I will do a separate video where I will talk about Git and GitHub for those who are not familiar with it, because I eventually need to link all of these codes. I remember that. So, and also you need to know where to host your websites as well. You're developing all of this. How do you share this? Of course, you won't take the whole folder and give it to somebody. It's like, hey, install VS Code and check it, right? So I'll show you that GitHub, at least for websites that does not require a backend, and we're not doing backend in this course, you can set things up on GitHub until React. Once we go to React, then we need to do some changes to GitHub to have GitHub host our website, or there are other options as well. So I plan to do a separate video for that, because if I do it now, it has to be rushed, and I don't want to do that for those who are new to this, right? So I'll stop here for today. In the next class, the things that we will do is we will work on the last aspect of CSS, which I want to show, that is pseudo elements. And the way we will learn to do that is through HTML table styling. Pseudo elements are best applicable to when you're styling tables. So we will style a table, and then we will move on to a CSS framework called Tailwind, which I personally like a lot. There are multiple options. Most of you might be familiar with maybe Bootstrap if you've worked in this domain before. I don't like Bootstrap. The reason is nothing against it, but it just creates similar looking websites, right? Tailwind gives you the opportunity to personalize even if you're using a framework, right? So that's why I kind of prefer Tailwind over that. Materialize is another option from Google. But yeah, so that's the agenda for the next class, HTML tables for pseudo elements, and then maybe start the setup for CSS Tailwind. And then that will end CSS essentially once you're done. So practice. Do not leave it after the class. You will not be able to keep up for sure. If nothing else, go to different websites, such as, everybody knows W3 Schools, right? There is a website, W3 Schools, but there is a better one. I wouldn't say better one, but it's a more, I like it better. There is a one from Mozilla. It's called MDN Docs. Okay, MDM Web Docs. Right, so this is basically by Mozilla, and it has all the different references for HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So go to CSS part, keep revising these different topics here. It's not going to take more than 20 minutes, right? Just remind yourself that these are the different things that are there. Okay, if necessary, make your own notes and a reference sheet that, okay, to do this, this is the property, these are the different value options. That's it. If you at least try this, you will be able to keep up to pace if you're working on this the first time. If you do not touch these things after the class, forget about it. Things are going to get incrementally more difficult. Okay, so please keep that in mind. All right, chop.
Thanks, Professor.
Yep. Come on.